This last bit of new material is counterintuitively what turns out to be everybody's favorite. By the end of this class, people just can't get enough of standardized tests, and it's so weird that everyone falls in love with them so much. So you can expect by the end of this video lecture, you will have experienced a roller coaster of emotions, and you will end up just falling in love with the idea of standardized tests. Okay, maybe that's an oversell. People tolerate this one, and actually, it starts out being difficult for some people to wrap their head around, but if you have enough practice, it ultimately ends up making sense, and they are very valuable. It's just usually not everybody's favorite topic. I typically ask the question to begin this class, how many people like standardized tests? And very few people raise their hand. Now, some people do, and that's fine, but most people don't like them. They think that they reduce people to numbers. They think that they treat people unfairly. They think that they end up penalizing the people that they're supposed to be helping the most. And all of that is somewhat true. But they are a necessary tool. And we're going to take a little bit of time to walk through that idea of why they matter so much. So we're going to cover a few topics today. One is the difference between norm and criterion reference test scores within standardized tests. We'll talk about common test metrics. We'll talk about the computer adaptive test and what the basic idea is. And we'll talk about the Wisconsin assessment system. Now, there are two real main ideas that we're going to be working with. One is standardization, and the second is operationalization. Now, standardization just means that I'm making things the same. When you treat somebody fairly, you're giving them a standard treatment in many cases, right? You're not playing favorites. Everybody gets the same amount of time. Everybody gets the same amount of resources, and so on. Operationalization involves making sure we identify what it is we're trying to measure so we can actually compare apples to apples. Now, a lot of times we are trying to measure these domains of knowledge, like math, science, social studies, and within those we're trying to measure specific traits, skills, knowledge, or qualities. And that's hard to do. Because when we take something like knowledge, right, we have to operationalize or put it in concrete terms what exactly we mean by knowledge. Is it just the recall of facts? Is it the integration of facts for comprehension? Do you have to apply those facts? What facts count? What facts don't count? And so on. And so these two ideas are essential to what standardized testing is all about. Now, a lot of times we think about the idea that, well, when you give somebody a standardized test, it's not really treating them fair because everybody's different, right? And here's a classic cartoon of a standardized test being given, and you can see the monkey's laughing because he's very happy. This test just happens to be what he was kind of designed for. Don't know how the fish is feeling. Don't know how the fish even got there. Don't see anybody who brought him, but we don't know. So this is the classic idea that standardized tests treat some people very unfairly. That's only the case when they are poorly constructed or misapplied or misinterpreted. When we think about what standardization is really about, we need to think about all the biases that we talked about way on in the beginning of this class. All our personal preferences, how we play favorites, confirmation bias, loss aversion, things like that. All these different biases color our perception of the world, then color our judgments and influence our decisions. And they often lead to things like segregation, racism, unequal treatment, the oppression of women for centuries, and so on. So when we think about all the different biases that we are susceptible to, we come across this challenge that what has resulted in our culture, in our world, from these biases. And we see that from an educational perspective, the best schools usually were gotten into based on not how good of a student you were or could be, but how rich your parents were or how connected they were. The best jobs are reserved for those people as well. And when we look at who was excluded, whole races, whole cultures, and so on, and the idea of standardized tests were started by, or championed really by this guy here. His name is Kaplan, and some of you may have taken some of the Kaplan test preparation courses. But he wanted to be a doctor and he wanted to go to Harvard, and he could not get in because he was Jewish at the time. And he thought that that was not fair because he was better qualified than a lot of the people who got in. He was a better student than a lot of the people who got in. He probably would have made a better doctor than a lot of the people who got in, but that's not who was getting into the program. And if in America we say that, everything should be fair and everyone should have an equal chance for the American dream, this was not the case. And that, Jewish people, black people, Latinx people, women, like as we've heard, short people, people who were born into a poor family, people with disabilities, all are at a major disadvantage because of the world they are brought into and the rules and the biases that influence people's judgments. So when we think about Martin Luther King's speech, or Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, that whole I have a dream sentiment about people being judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, is a standardization. It's operationalized what counts as a person. Well, character counts, not skin color. And people were functioning under a whole different system about what was the operationalized coin of the realm or the thing that we should value. In standardized testing or judgment practices, we identify what we care about and then we try to make it as fair as possible. And so it doesn't mean that everybody gets treated equal, right? Because depending on how I assess things, I might end up with some construct validity issues where I assess the wrong thing. And in some cases, right, giving student A the best education possible is not going to be the same as giving student B the best education possible, right? That would be like saying that there's one magic curriculum that everybody should take, regardless of what profession they're going into or what they care about, their personality style, what they like to do, personal preferences, and that's not true, right? So equal treatment is not the same thing as standardization in many cases. Although, depending on what we're measuring, it might have to be equal treatment, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It focuses on specific slices of the world through operationalization, as we talked about. This idea allows us to compare apples to apples, so it isn't the case that other constructs get in the way. So it isn't about how good looking you are, or how connected you are, or how wealthy your parents are, or what education they have, right? It's just about what can you do? Can you do the job? Can you succeed in this program, right? And it's meant to get rid of any biases, and it is possibly the most powerful force of social justice that we have. And when we talk about things like blind interviews, when we talk about having a equal representation in the job interview process, when we talk about the whole purpose in many cases of having a human resources department to file complaints against injustices and violations of the laws of the land that we have built in to try and make things fair. That's what standardization is all about. So it is incredibly important. Now, as far as some basic ideas go, we have in standardized tests two types of measures that we're going to be dealing with: norm-referenced measures and criterion-referenced measures. Norm-referenced just means that the score that you get doesn't just depend on what you do, but it also depends on what other people do. So when we think of the standards part of it, right, you have content areas, you set a bar, right? and I'm supposed to see whether or not I meet that standard. Well, if I'm looking at a norm reference test, it means that I'm graded on a curve, but not in the way that some of you have experienced, in a different way where the top, say, 10% of the people get an A, the next 10% of the people get a B, next 10 get a C, and so on. In that system, you can be really good and still get a C if everybody else is also really good, right? I think I mentioned this example before, but even, the person who comes in last in the Olympic 100-meter dash is a really fast person, even though they finished last. It matters what other people do. When you go to a job interview, it kind of matters what other people do. You could have a great interview, but if somebody has a better interview, you don't get the job. When we think of criterion referenced measures, it really only matters how you compare to a standard. And this is how most grading is done in schools, right? We do set the standard and we don't factor in a ranking system. We're just looking at whether or not you measured up to this pre-existing standard. Now, these measures have different characteristics, right? A lot of things in common is that they do require this operationalization, specification of the achievement domain, right? You need a sampling of items. You can't just go by one thing, and so on. So there's a lot of overlap. The main differences are in areas like how much stuff is covered. So norm reference tests usually are given because they're expensive and they take a lot of time. They cover a broad range of topics, where criterion reference tests usually are much more focused. Norm reference tests also emphasize discrimination among individuals, whereas criterion reference tests try to describe what people can and can't do. So in other words, in norm reference tests, I'm trying to rank people and tell them apart. Tell me who's high achieving and who's low achieving and who's better than who. Where criterion reference, I'm just trying to get an idea of what your strengths and weaknesses is and whether or not you can do the particular skills that we're talking about. Norm reference tests also have a lot of items of average difficulty, and typically doesn't have really easy or really difficult items. Now, the reason for this, again, is because I'm trying to separate people. I'm trying to tell them apart. If I give them a whole bunch of questions that are too hard, well, everybody gets them wrong and everyone looks the same. If I give them a bunch of questions that are too easy, everyone gets them right and everybody looks the same. I can't tell anybody apart. Because most people are of average ability, then I need to give average ability or average difficulty questions so I can start to have fine-tuned discrimination between all those people that are kind of lumped together in the middle. I might have a few hard, a few easy questions on there, but the real idea is to make sure that I can tell people apart. Criterion reference matches item difficulty to learning tasks. And again, this is where it's tied much more directly to specific objectives that we might have in the classroom. And so again, you will be giving criterion reference tests in your class. Finally, norm reference tests require a reference group in order for me to make some or draw some conclusions. In other words, when I say a reference group, I mean that there is a group of people that I'm ranking you against. It's not everybody in the world, typically. In most standardized tests, it's a given grade in a given state at a given time of year. So I might have a spring version of the Wisconsin forward exam or a spring version of the ACT, and I get norms for those 4 different grade levels, right? So 5th grade spring, 6th grade spring, freshman year spring, and so on. Sometimes I have national comparison groups, so things like the SAT and the ACT will try to draw conclusions about where you rank nationally and try to see where you place among all your peers of the same age or even of the same educational level of attainment. So high school graduates, college freshmen, and so on. Criterion reference interpretation really leans a lot more on the domain that you're talking about. So can you do, algebra or calculus, or do you understand particular areas of science, right? So in this case, we have not concerned about whether or not you're better than anybody else, or we're not concerned with figuring out how many people you're better than. We're just figuring out, again, whether you can do specific tasks. So to boil it all down, norm reference tests tell you where you are relative to others, and criterion reference tests tell you the extent to which you have mastered specific goals. Standardized tests just means that I am giving the same test under the same conditions to maximize fairness. In other words, in order to compare apples to apples, if I'm going to do either a norm reference or criterion reference tests, I need to take care of everything beforehand. Identify the domain, what's the content of the test, what are the questions going to be like, how am I going to operationalize the skills, and so on. Once I've done that, then I can administer the test, and I can use any set of questions really in a norm reference manner or a criterion reference manner. Typically, if the test has a specific purpose, it will be designed significantly differently based on these factors that we just described. So here is a review worksheet that we typically go through, and it's a lot more fun to discuss, but I'm just going to kind of walk you through it. Scenario 1. Your class takes an exam and your score is calculated based on the percentage of items you answered correctly. Well, now in this case, there's no information on whether or not I had the same or different resources, same or different amount of time, and so on. So I can't really say whether it's standardized or unstandardized, but I can see that my score is based on the percentage of items that I got correct. And if it's just that percentage, that's my score, well, that only depends on me. It doesn't matter what other people get, right? How it's interpreted might be a different story, but my score just depends on what I do. So it is a criterion reference test. In scenario 2, an entire school takes an exam and each student has the same resources and the same amount of time to complete the test. Now in this case, because there are same conditions and questions for test takers, that means it's a standardized test, or at least in part. However, there is no information on whether or not it's going to be a norm reference test or a criterion reference test. Now here's an interesting example. So you have a 5th grade class takes an exam and student scores are compared to the score of Billy Joel, who aced this test. He's got 100% back in 1975. People thought he cheated, but he was an innocent man. So now, in this case, there's no information on standardization, right? It just says a class took a test. Don't know anything else about it, so we can't assume. This one is debatable, because when we think about what makes it norm or criterion referenced, right? Because I'm being compared to someone else, does that make it norm referenced? Now, because Billy Joel's score was 100% and or because this is like the new benchmark or the standard, basically, right, that we're being compared to, maybe it's norm and criterion. The fact that he's somebody else makes it seem like seems like it's norm referenced, but the fact that it's compared to 1, somebody from long ago, 2, they got 100, and 3, they're kind of used as the new standard of success, seems like it is criterion referenced. Now, this leads us to this idea of, well, if I'm talking about a reference group that I'm comparing myself to, how many people does it have to be? Can I do it with 1 person? Sure, right? I did better or worse than this other person or the same as. So that could be a reference group. The other question is, well, do I have to have current data? Well, more recently, tests have current data, but 20 years ago, creating data sets was so time-consuming and so costly that they were only updated every several years. And so you would be in 1985, you're being compared to maybe people from 1981 in some cases. Some tests didn't test, especially like assessment inventories for young children, screening for disabilities, didn't update their norms for sometimes a decade. And so you have this idea of how recent does it have to be? Well, in this case, it's 45 years, and maybe that's a little too long, but that's a gray area. And the reason I bring up this example is that I want you to recognize, 1, that these are made-up terms. 2, that the concepts, while they are fairly distinct, have some hybrid categories. Just like if you've ever gone through a science class and noticed that some things like tomatoes seem to fall in multiple categories, bananas as well, things like that. And it's not necessarily clear because the rules we have made up usually aren't sufficient. And so we've made up rules based on some general ideas, but not every example is going to fit in those rules, kind of like Bloom's taxonomy, right? We try to talk about the difference between comprehension and application, but boy, there are some things that seem to be a bit in both. And that's true for every category of basically everything that we can come up with. So keep that in mind going forward in your real life. Here's some easier examples. Scenario 4, you take an exam and the professor grades on a curve with the highest 10% getting A's, just what I was saying before. In this case, no information on standardized or unstandardized, but because in this case the grade you get depends on what other people do, this is a norm reference test. Scenario 5, you take an exam and you are graded as minimal, basic, proficient, or advanced. Again, no information on whether it's standardized or unstandardized. Because there are performance categories, it would be, under most circumstances, a criterion reference test, unless they determine who was advanced by their percentile ranking. Are in the top 25%, well then they're advanced. The next they're proficient and so on. That's typically not how it's done, so this would, under most interpretations, be a criterion reference test. Finally, a school takes an exam and each student is allowed whatever amount of time they need to complete it, and each student can use his or her smartphone to answer questions. Highest performers determine the grades of the other students. Well, it's unstandardized clearly because of the different conditions. People have different resources. And it's norm reference because scores depend on what others do. Now, a couple more questions. Say that you take a math test and the score is in the 98th percentile. Does that mean you are a math genius? Why or why not? Now, this is all about what are the limitations of these different types of test scores. One, just being in the 98th percentile doesn't mean anything unless you know the reference group. If it's everybody in the world, maybe. If it's college graduates, maybe. It's more likely still that you're a math genius, but probably not. If you're among math majors, different thing. Math graduate students, math doctoral students, right? When you get to that point, if you're in the 98th percentile, it's pretty much a guarantee. But if I'm comparing you against kindergartners and you're you right now, I don't think that means a lot that you know more math and can do it better than 98%, or as well as, or better than 98% of the kindergartners. Question 2, you take a math test and get 97% correct. Does that mean you're good at math? Again, no way to tell. You need to know what the content of that test was. If it was adding single-digit numbers, I would expect you to get 100. Question 3, you find that you're in the bottom 1% of the people who took a vocabulary test. Should you be put in special education classes? Again, you need to know the content and the reference group. Who am I comparing you against? All kids in your grade? Well, if you're in the bottom 1%, then yeah, maybe you would qualify for special services, depending on the nature of the test. If I'm comparing you to all the people who entered the National Spelling Bee competition, well, that's okay. You're probably still pretty good. Question 4, an 8th grader takes a math test and scores in the 87th percentile. So he starts taking classes with high school seniors. He's disappointed because he is consistently in the bottom 10% of the class. He takes another test with this class and finds that he is at the 22nd percentile. Why did his scores change so much from when he was in 8th grade? Well, because his reference group changes, his norm reference scores are going to change. It's kind of like the big fish in a small pond. You're the big fish, but when you move into a much bigger lake, you find that you're not the big fish anymore, and there are a lot of fish bigger than you. You can think about it, Division 1, 2, 3 in athletics, right? The Warhawk football team has been really good, but if we move to Division 1, man, it'd be tough to compete, right? Just different levels of talent. Likewise, if a Division 1 team moved down to Division 3, even a mediocre team, that has Division 1 level talent would dominate in Division 3 just based on the overall athleticism of the players. So, at any rate, those are the ins and outs of norm referenced tests. What they tell you, what they don't tell you, right? And we need both of them because they each give us a different slice of the truth. It's important to know where you stand among your peers. It's important to know when you're choosing a profession that you have a good chance of success in a particular area, right? You can't just compare yourself to your friends because you might be the best scientist or the best artist among your friends, but you may not stack up to anybody else, right? It's just that your friends are very bad at those things. So you have to be careful about local comparisons. Also, the criterion or the norm reference test doesn't tell you if you're any good. You could be the cream of the crop, as they say, really good, best of the best, or you could be the cream of the crap. And just because you beat out your reference group doesn't mean necessarily that you're proficient from a criterion reference perspective. Criterion reference, again, tells you whether or not you are successful or unsuccessful in an area, but it doesn't tell you where you rank, right? If we lower the standards, everybody can be successful, but then when it comes time later on for things to get competitive, and it starts to matter how good you are compared to your peers. Now we realize we didn't have enough information to make good decisions. So if you have kids, these are important things to know about your kids. If you're thinking about yourself, it's important to know about yourself. Now we're going to go into norm reference test scores and how we interpret the different metrics. We're going to look at several, and each one gives us a little bit of the truth, right? And we have to be careful that we don't misinterpret them. Parents will ask you questions. You should have answers.
If we're going to look at norm reference test results, some things that we need to remember. 1. Test norm should match the test taker regarding personal characteristics. In other words, if I'm comparing myself to a group of people and trying to figure out where I stand, I should be comparing myself to people like me. I shouldn't be comparing myself to people who are much worse than myself or much better than myself or have nothing to do with me. So if I'm a fifth grader, I don't want to compare myself necessarily to high schoolers or kindergartners or 80-year-olds, right? Other fifth graders. Point 2, test norms should accurately represent the population they're trying to depict, meaning that when people create these kind of norms under which we compare ourselves or our students to, they typically or traditionally don't actually take all the test scores, say, of all the fifth graders in Wisconsin. They take a small sample, maybe 1,000, 2,000 people of all the fifth graders in Wisconsin, and they kind of generalize out from there. And you want to make sure, one, that those norms accurately reflect Wisconsin. So you can't take everyone from up north Wisconsin and then apply those norms to everyone all over in the urban and suburban areas as well. Likewise, you can't just norm everything on people in Beloit and then try to apply it to everybody else in Wisconsin. You have to take a representative sample. So basically what they do is they kind of mirror what the state looks like. So they might take, 50 people from southeastern Wisconsin, the Milwaukee, Racine area, and then they would have to take maybe 20 people from Madison or that area. And then they just take a couple people from here and there. Now, that would be a very small sample going forward. So they're probably targeting maybe 2 to 5,000 people. These days, technology does make it possible, though, to actually rank you according to where you stand in everybody in the state. It's just not how it's been traditionally done. And it causes some issues, but that's kind of where everyone should be going in the future. Third thing, test norms should be up to date, meaning that you can't be comparing yourself to, high schoolers or college students or fifth graders back in the 1920s or the 1800s, right? It's got to be here and now. Academic standards change, knowledge changes, knowledge that's important changes. And if you've ever seen one of those 1800s tests that people had to take to get out of their primary grades, a lot about farming. And unless you work on a farm back in the olden days, you probably won't know a lot of that information. Likewise, they would have no idea of how to answer questions about technology or modern events because it would just be completely foreign to them. So you have to make sure the test norms are up to date. Um, Test norms should be comparable across tests, meaning that if I have different versions of the state test, I should be able to compare those norms. If I have two different versions of an IQ test, I should be able to compare norms across those tests, even though they might score things very differently. The final thing is that test norms should provide the information so you can make some kind of judgments about 1 through 4. In other words, every test should come with a handbook that outlines what the reference group is, how the data was collected and gathered, when it was collected and gathered, and how it compares to other tests. And that way you can feel pretty confident going forward when you get a standardized test or test result about what it actually means. And that's kind of where you come in all this, right? Parents will come to you with questions, and it's important for you to be able to kind of break it down for them in an easy way to understand. We'll find that some things make sense and some things don't really help. It's just the nature of the game. Right now, then, would be a good time before we get into the different types of test scores to take out the practice standardized test questions sheet and kind of try to answer them as we go through. Now, they're not in any particular order. I think it's a good exercise to try to figure out what question is about what. And if you have any questions on it, again, let me know. I will be posting the answers so you can have access to those and try to see if it all makes sense. If it doesn't, great idea would be to shoot me an email or make an appointment. So when we talk about different types of test scores, we're really talking about different norm reference test scores and different criterion reference test scores. In norm reference scores, we're going to talk about standard scores, scaled scores, grade equivalents, Steinein's percentile ranks, percentile ranges, and normal curve equivalents. Again, some of these will make sense and some of these will just, well, they'll be a mystery and with no practical value. You just got to know what they are and what they relate to. When we talk about criterion reference scores, standard performance indices and objective performance indices are basically the same thing, just slightly different name. And then we'll talk about the general performance categories. And we're going to weave the forward exam into these discussions when it's appropriate. So looking at the standard kind of output that I'm going to be giving you, you have a couple different types of norm reference scores. Note that everything on here is a norm referenced score. They are all calculated by comparing you to other people. Okay, you have your scaled score, you have your grade equivalencies, your national Steinin, national percentile, and your national percentile range. The diamonds and the bars represent or correspond to the national percentile and the national percentile range. The diamond is the actual percentile value, and the bar represents the range. You'll note that you have percentiles up on top here, and then you have Steinines down here, and you'll notice there's 9 of them. We'll get back to that later on. I have some definitions on some of these slides that might be helpful for you to look at. I also handed out and will have online the quick norm referenced output guide that gives a brief description of each thing. Doesn't tell you the whole story, but it gives you a brief description. Okay, so first one, standard scores. Well, standard scores really just mean that we are converting whatever kind of test you have into a common form. To do this, we need a few basics. One, we need to calculate the mean, and that's just the average. So I give everybody the test, I find out what the average score is. No big deal. The next thing I need to find out is the deviation, and so I'm basically trying to figure out how everybody is different from the mean. Now, some people will score right on the mean, or they'll be exactly average. Some will be above, some just slightly above the average, some very far above the average. Some will be below the average, and some very far below the average. The deviation score is just where they are relative to that mean. So if you are above the mean, you'll have a positive score. If you are below the mean, you'll have a negative score. Now, this leads into the idea of the standard deviation. And you can think of it like what is the average difference. Standard meaning kind of average or typical, and deviation meaning difference. if you think about it that way, it's just, I look at how far people are away from the average, from the mean, and the standard deviation is just saying, if I look at how far people away are, some are 5 points, some are 10 points, some are 20 points. A lot of people are really close, maybe 1 or 2 points away. So a lot of people are actually exactly the average. Um, if I averaged out those differences and kind of said, well, what's the average difference between somebody and the mean? Um, I'd get some kind of way of indicating with a single number how close people are packed together or how far apart they are. Now, if I give a test, that's out of 100 points, and I find that all my scores, almost everybody got like an 85 to 90. And I got a few hundreds, and the lowest score is like an 80. Now that tells me something, and if I calculated a standard deviation, it might be like 5 points, meaning that the typical difference between any person I would pick at random and the average would be about 5 points. If, on the other hand, I had another test, 100 points, and the average score was, say, 60, and I had some people who got like a 10, a lot of people got 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, some people who got 70s, 80s, and 90s, and maybe I got 100 as well, right? If I looked at how far those people are on the average from the mean, I would have a much bigger number because my scores are much more spread out. So when standard deviations are large, it means that there's a lot of differences between people. When they're very small, it means that there are very few or very small differences between people. Now, the way that all these things come together is through the calculation of a z-score, or what's called a standard score. Now, once we can calculate the z-score, we can transform our scores into almost anything else. And if you've come across t-scores in special ed, or you've looked at any scaled scores, you are working with something that once was a z-score and has been transformed. What you do is you just look at the top part of the equation, and it just takes the individual score, subtracts the average. Again, this will give you a positive value if you are above average, and it'll give you a negative value if you are below average. Then I divide that by the standard deviation, which again is just the typical difference between any individual and the mean. And that gives me a z-score, or basically it tells me how far above or below the mean I am in terms of standard deviations. So if I was one standard deviation above the mean, I would have a z-score of positive 1. If I was a half standard deviation below the mean, I would have a z-score of negative 0.5. Now, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to a lot of people because the idea of standard deviation is somewhat sketchy. And I don't really care if you can calculate z-scores because, quite frankly, you probably will never deal with them. The idea behind it, though, is that it gives us a way of ranking people, and it gives us a way to convert one set of test scores to another by first turning them into z-scores, and then once we're done, we can kind of flip that equation around and turn them into raw scores. So I can take somebody's z-score, I can take a new standard deviation, I can take a new mean, and I can flip all those together to create a new raw score. What this allows us to do then is make kind of apples to apples comparisons across different tests. If you look here, I have test A that has, well, an average score right here, and I see that my range of scores is, it's moderate. If I look at test B, I have a different range, I have a different mean. But if I look at how these both line up with my z-scores, my z-score will always have a mean of 0, and its standard deviation will always be 1. So I go from 0 to positive 1. Well, that corresponds to this score on test A and corresponds to this score on test B. Likewise, if I'm far below the mean, I find that I have a z-score of negative 2, and it corresponds with this score on test A and this score on test B. Now, what we can do then is create some kind of scaled score, meaning that I'm just going to transform my z-score, whatever my original raw scores were, into kind of a standard set of values that I will use continuously. Now I can make my scaled scores whatever I want. If I want to rescale everything from 0 to 10, I can do that. If I want to make it from 0 to 100, I can. If I want to make it from 37 and a half to 52 and 3/4, I can do that. If I want to make it in the millions, I can do that, right? And if we look at some examples from the forward exam, we see that I have these different values in different content areas. Here's English language arts, and here are mathematics, performance art, or performance scores, and I have them across different grades, right? A couple things you'll know or notice. When I'm looking at my below basic or my lowest scaled score for grade 3 in English language arts, it's 330. My high is 900. Now, why those numbers? I don't know. I wasn't involved in those conversations, and I haven't been able to find a good account of why those specific values were chosen. If we look across then and compare that to the math scores, well, my low score in grade 3 for math isn't 330, it's 360. And my high score is at 900, it's in the 700s. And if I look, I see I have a different range from here to here, and then it changes for each grade. Now the numbers keep getting higher from grade to grade if I'm looking, vertically up and down here, because it's trying to represent some kind of growth. And they make the test so that it makes sense in how much people are progressing. The key thing that isn't intuitive or doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I don't think that it's worth your while to try to make sense of it, is what a particular value means, because it changes according to scale. And if I look at social studies and I look at science, I have yet more differences. I still have that progression, right? But if I look at my socials or I look at my science performance, right, my low score in grade 4 is 190 and goes to 600. Well, my third grade language arts was 300 and went up to 900, or 330 and went to 900. And so a number itself doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it's so contextual. What you should be familiar with, whichever grade you end up teaching, or if you bounce across grades, is what the different category boundaries are, right? Know that below basic is your lowest category, and it represents this range of scores. Basic represents this range of scores. Performance or proficiency represents this, and advanced represents this. And that is really the only meaning that you have. Now, they have some examples of what these different categories mean. So advanced means, right, that you have a thorough understanding of an ability to apply knowledge and skills. Proficient means that students demonstrates adequate understanding and ability, right? And again, this idea of thorough versus adequate, those are fuzzy words that don't always make a lot of sense, and you'll have to do some figuring out what those things mean on your own and where you want those standards to set. But they've kind of drawn a line in the sand to kind of carve these different scores into these different categories, right? Then we have basic and below basic. The old term used to be minimal, but they got away from that. I guess they felt it was kind of politically incorrect. Now, when we're looking at the forward exam, and we're going to kind of do a little segue here while we're talking about scaled scores and so on. Those scaled scores are the result of looking at all these different subcategories over here on the right, and you get different questions for each section depending on your grade level and the current situation, very contextual. And they just kind of get a total score in each content area. Now, each content area, and it's great that they do this, is broken down into sub-skills. And those sub-skills tell you really what you should be working on. They represent the standards of that particular grade. They represent these larger concepts, these larger buckets that what you're spending your time teaching fall into, right? And if you want to understand what each one of these are, there are descriptions that go with them, but they're usually pretty self explanatory,